This is a CBC podcast.
Well, yesterday on the show, we spoke to Horizon Health's Dr. Gordon Dow about how COVID-19 is being spread. Despite the more recent focus on airborne spread of the virus, public health officials believe it's likely that 2 clusters of COVID cases in Fredericton may have been spread through surface transmission. It's a surprising finding for many because experts have focused less on surfaces and more on mask wearing as we understood more about how the infection is spread. Dr. Samira Mubaraka is a microbiologist and clinical scientist at the Sunnybrook Health Services Centre in Toronto. Her research focuses on viral transmission and aerobiology, and we've reached her this afternoon in Toronto. Good afternoon.
Hi there.
So what is the latest science when it comes to surface transmission versus airborne transmission of COVID-19?
Yeah, so the mode of transmission for SARS coronavirus 2 obviously is a matter of significant debate. And we often see these kinds of debates emerge often when there's a paucity of science. So, there's a lot of data available for other potential pathogens, but there are massive gaps when it comes to SARS coronavirus 2. So we're at the stage now where we have to make inferences or try and understand what's happening based on, really kind of messy data. In other words, real world data, which will vary significantly from one circumstance to another.
So it really seems to be investigation. I mean, health officials here have been investigating 2 clusters in the Fredericton area, one at a university residence and the other in a hotel. And they say it's likely that surface transmission is responsible for a spread in those areas. What would confirm surface transmission?
Yeah, so there are a couple of things that you can do. You can sample the surfaces, and that's something that we've done at the hospital here in Toronto. And you can sample them and look for the virus itself, the viral RNA, which is probably one common approach. And then the other thing you can do is also try and grow the virus. And obviously you need the right biocontainment to be able to do that and see whether or not it's infectious. The thing that I think is challenging that maybe we need to reframe around a little bit is that surfaces can become contaminated probably through 2 main routes. So one can be a contaminated hand. So someone's infectious and, is shedding COVID and they sneeze or cough into their hand, and that hand touches things and potentially contaminates those surfaces. But the other way that surfaces can become contaminated is if you're actually breathing out virus and you're shedding it, and for a period of time those particles are floating around in the air, and for a period of time after, depending on the size of the particles, on the relative humidity, on the temperature, and on the ventilation, they may or may not settle. And even if they do settle onto a surface, they can be re-aerosolized with more activity. So in a way, there's almost this continuum between the air and surfaces. And particles may potentially go from one medium, like the air, to another, like a surface, and maybe even get re-aerosolized. So I appreciate why people want to understand which is the major contributor. But I think the reality is, based on our experience, it's really circumstantial. You may see a bigger buildup on surfaces if the ventilation is poor, for example. But if the ventilation is excellent, that might not be the case, and maybe you get less surface contamination. It's really hard to pin down exactly which of those 2 modes contributed in many ways to transmission, although there might be some, I haven't followed what the details of the investigation are, but maybe they do have data to support that surfaces are mainly responsible. But I think the net effect is I think we know what we need to do in general, right? Like it still comes back to keeping a distance. Outside is better than inside. Washing hands and trying to keep surfaces clean, all is part of the package, because you don't really always know for every single circumstance which is going to be the biggest risk of exposure, right?
Yeah, it sounds like, these methods of transmission are linked in a lot of ways, and it may not be that, a virus is going through the ventilation system, but it could be that, there's more virus in a room on things if there's poor ventilation. Is that what I'm understanding?
Yeah, I think it's quite circumstantial. Even if there's good ventilation, you could still have virus on the surfaces, right? It really depends on, how it got there and how symptomatic someone is, and whether or not, the particles that they were emitting are small enough to be carried away, or if they're all settling down. So you're right, they are linked, and that's why there's really no one method that's going to prevent transmission. So it's not going to be just about masks or just about cleaning surfaces. It's why we're all kind of trying to layer the Swiss cheese to make sure that the holes don't overlap, if that kind of makes sense. So based on, and that's why we keep doing outbreak investigations. It provides insight into our understanding, but they might be finding things that strongly suggest that surfaces played more of a significant role for that particular outbreak, and for other outbreaks it might be different, right? It's so hard to compare the relative contribution of the different modes may vary if it's a warehouse or a household or a long-term care unit or a school, right? You can see how those are very diverse environments and settings where you might see more or less surface accumulation, you might see more or less transmission through the air, really depending on the situation there.
So what do we know about how long the virus can stay on a surface and still be transmissible?
Probably not surprisingly, I'm going to say that there's still some gaps in the data. Part of it depends on the type of surface.
Okay.
So there are surfaces called porous surfaces. So think of things like clothing or towels, so cloth types of things. They don't tend to persist as long on those types of surfaces. When you think about hard, non-porous surfaces, things like steel, they're more likely to persist longer. And there's a range, depending on the study that you read, from minutes to hours. I think, and I'm prepared to be wrong on this, some people may have claimed even days, but I think really have to look at what the readout was. Were they looking at just viral RNA, so just a little bit of the viral genome, or were they actually looking at infectiousness? So the SARS virus that was infecting people during the first wave is different from the virus that's infecting people now. And there are a number of changes that happened over the course of the year, and the variants of concern are probably the most important or significant change. So we need to understand, are those maybe more hardy in the environment? So we're working on that now, and it's a great question, because it could, play some role in how long people leave things, right?
Yeah.
Before they proceed. Like, I know for deliveries and things like that, for a while I had the habit of just leaving it, not touching it for a day or so, and I started to wonder to myself, well, is this actually rational? What's the data behind it? You sort of form these habits. I know I probably sound like a broken record, but as long as you're washing your hands afterwards, or if you can clean the surface, then that's really helpful until we have a much better sense.
I think we're just going to have to live with the fact that the answers aren't definitive at this point, and we need to follow all of the recommendations, layering the Swiss cheese, as you put it.
That's right. Cover up those holes with more layers. Like the data that we do, there are data out there that we do have around infectiousness for the first and second waves of virus, like the viruses, and that's why I hesitate to put an actual time on it, because I can't confirm that that's the same for for example, here in Ontario, over 80% of our COVID-19 cases are caused by a variant, right? And I can't say that that's the same. Clearly, the variants are more transmissible, and why that is, we're starting to learn that there are characteristics about the virus itself that make it replicate much better. But it's not like we've actually tested them side by side and seen what their survival is on surfaces or in air yet. So that's why I hesitate to really apply the data from the first couple of waves, because if it's different for variants of concern, then people might feel misled. So.
Yeah. I think it's difficult for a lot of people to wrap their minds around this, just because in recent months, the focus has been much more on transmission through the air and a lot less on transmission on surfaces. And some things have been de-emphasized. I've even seen, sanitization described as theater that makes people feel better but doesn't do a lot. I wonder if if we've lost something in the last few months in terms of how are people to interpret the information that they're getting and ensure that, they're doing the right things?
So that it's interesting you point that out, because I think a number of us have agreed that this has probably been the most challenging messaging around the whole pandemic, right? From, the recommendations for masks back in the spring, initially it was no, and then it was yes, to now. Things tend to wax and wane as more data comes out. So I think that's part of it. And I think there have been a number of aerosol studies that have come out, and that's potentially why. And maybe there are relatively fewer surface studies. Maybe it's true that surfaces do play less of a role. And I think there are two approaches we need to take. One, look at it experimentally. Once people feel it's safe to do so, but also try and get more real world data. We've done a lot of sampling ourselves in different settings, but most of them have been healthcare settings. Maybe it's time to start thinking about doing some studies, in the community, whether it's universities or schools, and trying to look at that. Some people are doing that, but I think part of it is that there is a paucity of data, and every time that happens, whenever there are knowledge gaps, debates kind of come through. So I have to say, I think I do not doubt that aerosols, and by saying aerosols, I mean particles suspended in air, regardless of their size. So not just the small airborne particles. I think aerosols do play a significant role in transmission, but I don't think we can discount the possibility that heavily contaminated surfaces can lead to exposure. So again, I appreciate that this is not easy messaging. I don't think that it's cut and dry, either air or surface. It's probably they are linked. And I think that the measures that we've been taking thus far have really significantly reduced the risk of transmission. Vaccination is going to reduce it even more. I hope that's somewhat helpful, and I hope that, eventually we'll be able to be much more concrete about it and be able to detail to people which circumstances air versus surface are the major contributor. But that's going to take a lot of work that, a number of us have been focusing on over the last year, but we'll need more data, especially with the variants of concerns.
All right. Listen, thanks so much for your time and your expertise this afternoon. I appreciate it.
My pleasure. Keep well.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.
For more CBC podcasts, go to cbc.ca/podcasts.